About 10 years ago, I was watching a movie and it really drew me in. In fact, it kind of ambushed me and caught me off guard because it helped me find myself. It made me realize that I really hadn't been doing a lot of reflection or introspection. And this movie was kind of like lifting the rug on my life and allowing me to see the stuff that I had ignored for too long. And reminded me that life is this precious gift and I really hadn't been living up to my fullest potential. And so when the movie was over, I was inspired. I wanted to get up and take charge of my life and really make a difference. And then I decided to watch the same movie again about a year later. But it didn't have the same impact the second time around. And it caused me to think that maybe it wasn't the movie in and of itself, but the fact that its message spoke to me in a time in my life that I needed to hear it the most. It led me into this transformative moment. And it was at that point in my journey that I began to realize the power of a story. Think about Jesus for a moment. He's remembered in history as this great teacher of wisdom, and yet his primary form of teaching is storytelling. When a legal expert comes to Jesus and asks, "What are the greatest commandments?" Jesus responds, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength." And the second one is like it, "You shall love your neighbor as you love yourself." And then the legal expert wants some clarification. Who's my neighbor? And Jesus knows that as humans, we're really good at looking for the loophole. So instead of just giving this flat answer that everyone is your neighbor, Jesus tells a story. In fact, he tells a story about someone who would have been this legal expert's enemy. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And the point is that our neighbor is every single person. People who don't look like us, or think like us, or believe like us. And it seems that the power of these stories is they help us find the version of ourselves that we've been trying to hide. We call Jesus' stories parables. And the Greek word for parable is parable. It means to cast alongside of. And we might think of it as kind of comparing or serving as a sermon illustration. Jesus does this again in the story of the prodigal son. He helps us find the version of ourselves that we've been trying to hide. In the story, there are three main characters. There's the youngest son, the elder son, and the father. And depending on what we might be experiencing in our lives, each of the characters hit us in different ways. And so sometimes we might see ourselves in the younger son, sometimes we might find ourselves in the elder son, and sometimes we might find ourselves in the position of God, where we need to open our doors and we need to run to those who have come back home. And this is the power of a story, when we can find the version of ourselves that we've been hiding. I shared in the first session, Wagon Wheel, that the exile is kind of this dry and dusty period in Israel's history. And it seems that maybe some of the biblical authors told stories to put flesh and blood on the experiences that the people of God were having. And so we have stories like Daniel, the story of this man who is a faithful Jew living outside of the nation of Israel. Each day, Daniel goes to his window and he prays. He prays in this really visible place, even when it becomes illegal. And consequently, Daniel is thrown in the den of lions. And we know that Daniel is preserved. God spares his life. Similarly, a few chapters ahead, we find another story of his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who won't bow down to the Babylonian deity, and so they're thrown into the fiery furnace. But we know that their lives are spared. They remain unharmed. And so, the prevailing message is that for those of you who are living in the exile, if you remain faithful to Yahweh, if you trust God, then you will be vindicated when you suffer for righteousness. Another story that we find during the same period of the exile is the story of Esther, who becomes the queen. And she uses her position as a leverage to be able to have some influence. And she spares her people, the Hebrew people, from being massacred. And the famous line from the story is, who knows, Esther, maybe you've been raised up for such a time as this. And it kind of reminds us that there are times that we can't control the circumstances around us. And yet God still has a purpose for our lives. When we can't control our situations or our circumstances, God still has a purpose for all of us. God has raised each of us up for such a time as this. Another story that's set around that same time period, we might not really think of it that way, is the story of Jonah. We usually think of Jonah being swallowed up by this fish, and of course, yeah, that's how the story goes, but it goes much deeper than that. In 722 BC, the Assyrians invaded the northern kingdom of Israel. They destroyed the communities there. They murdered people, and then they took survivors into exile. And in order for us to understand the story of Jonah, we need to know that the capital of Assyria is Nineveh. And so if you've ever wondered why Jonah is so dead set against going to Nineveh, well, that's why. The people of Assyria, the people of Nineveh, they've done great harm to the nation of Israel. Jonah doesn't want to go there. And when he does reluctantly end up in Nineveh, he preaches this message of judgment. That's really the only time that Jonah seems happy, is he's preaching this message of judgment, hoping that God will destroy them. But they repent. God forgives them. They turn around. And Jonah is extremely unhappy. In fact, the story ends kind of with this cliffhanger. Jonah has completely been out of shape because the people of Nineveh, they've repented. And it almost seems like God is holding up this mirror for the nation of Israel and saying, hey, this is a caricature of who you've become. You've received my grace and my mercy and forgiveness, and yet you really haven't learned how to extend it to others. The purpose for the nation of Israel was to be a blessing to all the other nations of the earth, to be the light of the world to all the Gentiles. And it seems that God is saying, if you're going to fulfill this mission, you're going to have to learn how to love and forgive your enemies. And so in each of these stories, the Israelites, they are called and compelled to find themselves in the story, to find the versions of themselves that they've been trying to hide. In his book, Being Christian, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, says, now that brings us to the complicated question of the Bible's historical claims. Is the Bible accurate history? Some people get very anxious indeed about this. Large volumes have been written trying to show that, for example, what the book of Daniel says about Babylonian history can be squared with what we know about Babylonian history elsewhere. I admire the ingenuity that goes into this, but I am not at all convinced that such people have quite got the right end of the stick. Does God really want us to know in exact detail ancient Babylonian history? I suspect not. But I am confident that God does want us to know how people in circumstances of acute displacement, living with the fear and the anxiety of a persecuted minority, responded to a hostile state and pagan power. And Daniel certainly tells us that. He tells us with force and depth that those stories, as much as any in the Old Testament, have entered into the imagination of a whole civilization. It is a very few people indeed who do not know something about Daniel in the lion's den. He goes on to say, so what does God want us to know? What does he want to tell us? He wants to tell us that there was a moment in the history of ancient Israel when, in the light of the experience of exile and persecution, God's people had to sit down and think and pray and imagine with a new intensity how they could be faithful in such circumstances. God wants us to know that, and he wants us to know what response they came up with, and he wants us to ask ourselves, where are we in this story? So as Bishop Williams has said, sometimes people get really anxious, wondering about, did this stuff really happen? Did Jonah really get swallowed up by a great fish? Was Daniel really in a den of lions? Are these stories about real, historical, factual people? Now, for me personally, it's just really of no consequence either way. Because I see these as stories where God is trying to teach us something. And it's interesting because when we read the stories that Jesus tells, we kind of instinctively know that we're not supposed to ask those kinds of questions about how tall was the Good Samaritan or how much money exactly did the prodigal son squander, because we realize that that's not the point, that Jesus isn't talking about real historical factual people, that Jesus is trying to help us find the version of ourselves that we've been trying to hide. And so for me, I'm not trying to influence anyone one way or the other. If you believe that these are real, literal, historical events, that's absolutely fine. I think the only challenge is that sometimes we might think the point of the story is that it happened. We kind of treat it as a matter of fact, and we fail to reflect. We fail to allow the story to ambush us, to catch us by surprise, so that we can find ourselves. And when we look at these stories, we discover that there's something deeper going on, that there is something more than literal happening. There's some kind of a message and a meaning. And if we miss that part, well, we miss what God is trying to say. It's important to remember that even when it comes to the portions of the Hebrew Bible that we think of as historical record, like the story of the Kings in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, that their primary function isn't to convey information, but to invite us into transformation. And so these events have been interpreted theologically and shaped into stories, so that there's now a plot, and there's character development. There are literary devices like climax and comparison and contrast and irony, and all of these different elements draw us in and compel us. They ambush us, and they help us find ourselves. Before the end of this session, I want to have a kind of where the rubber meets the road kind of moment. Why does any of this matter? Well, obviously we can't go through the entire Old Testament verse by verse, but I want to give you some tools for the next time that you do. One of the things that it's important to know when we're reading narratives in the Old Testament is a lot of times they intentionally lack description. That might sound a little bit odd, but this is the way that Hebrew narrative was written. They intentionally lack description. And I've already talked about Abraham in a previous session, but there was just this example that it was too good to pass up. It's the story of how God tells Abraham to take his one and only son Isaac and sacrifice him on an altar. That's in Genesis 22:2. And in the very next verse, we're given Abraham's response. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. We're not given any description of Abraham's feelings, any internalization. We're not told anything about him getting angry or upset or arguing with God. And maybe all of those things happen, but the biblical authors have chosen not to tell us. Why? Well, because whenever there's a lack of description, it causes us to ask more questions. It's interesting that sometimes we've been given the impression that we shouldn't ask questions about God. In fact, Abraham is hailed as an example of someone who doesn't ask God questions. And the irony is that this was designed for us to ask questions. The Bible was designed to invite us to ask more questions than it is to give us black and white answers. We ask questions of, why didn't Abraham get angry? If that was me, this is what I would say. And that's the exact point of it. We're supposed to be placing ourselves in Abraham's shoes. We're supposed to be thinking of ourselves in his position, putting ourselves into the story. And so when we read the Old Testament, it intentionally lacks description, and it's an invitation for you to ask questions. When I think of the stories that Jesus tells, it reminds me of what happens when I eat popcorn and the shell from the kernel gets stuck between my teeth in the back of my mouth, and it takes me forever to get it out. The stories of the parables are supposed to afflict us spiritually, provoke us, keep us awake at night like a splinter under our fingernail. They're subversive. And there's tension in the story. And I think that that's true of the stories that we find in the Old Testament as well. One of the things that we find is paradox, especially in the story about Moses and Pharaoh. You remember when Moses went into Egypt and said, "Let my people go." In part of the story, the verbs are passive, which suggests that God is the agent who hardens Pharaoh's heart. And part of the verbs are active, which suggests that Pharaoh is the agent who hardens his own heart, which raises the question, well, which one was it? Was it God or was it Pharaoh? And the answer is yes. It reminds us that we have a tendency to oversimplify things. But the paradox draws us deeper into the story and causes us to ask more questions. It seems as humans we tend to lean in one direction or another. Some of us tend to see more of divine sovereignty where God is interacting in the world and pushing buttons and pulling levers. And some of us tend to lean in the direction of there being a lot at stake when it comes to human freedom. And this story tells us that this tension is real, that it exists, and that we shouldn't downplay one or the other. That there might be moments in history where God hardens someone's heart, and there are times whenever we as humans, we have the choice to allow our hearts to be hardened. And so just thinking upon it allows us to reflect theologically. It draws us in deeper and helps us find ourselves in the story. Have there been times in my own life that I've allowed my own heart to be hardened? And that's some pretty deep stuff. It's pretty challenging when we take the time to find the version of ourselves that we've been trying to hide. And that's the power of a story.